Also, to Graham Sait. Graham, we distribute Nutrotech Solutions products. We met over 9 years ago. Well, it was 10 years ago because we did all the soil tests with Nutrotech. When Carolyn, we spoke about Carolyn yesterday, and she spoke that we sent them there, and we've had an incredible relationship, and Graham is just the leader of this company, and he's out there inspiring the world to do what we do as well. So as I said yesterday, dare to be different, stand out from the crowd, and you be a beacon to go out there and change more people as well. Graham said don't read his CV, it's too long, he's doing too much, and I'd like to hand over to Graham Sait to speak right now.
Thank you, Rhonda. Pleasure to be here. I've just returned. I've had 6 weeks of international travel. Interestingly, that started in the US a couple of hours out of San Francisco, speaking to the Dole Corporation. The Dole Corporation are the world's largest food producers, according to them. I haven't checked to see whether they're right, but they've got thousands of farms and thousands of farms that supply their wholesaling division. One of their growers I've been working with, well, we don't actually distribute in the US, but he'd ask questions and I'd work with him from Georgia, a blueberry grower. Didn't know I was a Dole farm manager. He had tremendous results on the strength of that. They sent one of their scientists over to do the 4-day course. He wrote his little comment, I had great expectations of this course and they were exceeded by between 350 and 400%. He had to be very accurate like a scientist. He went back and sort of spread the word to the powers that be. They hired me to come over for 2 days to speak to their scientists and their farm managers from all over the US. And at the end of that time, they announced, to my absolute astonishment, that within a month they had to have a working paper to convert the entire organisation to biological within the next 12 months. So I don't really think that they can do it in that short a time, but they want to have it underway by Christmas. And you know, sometimes it feels like 2012 is actually happening when you see things on that scale. I travelled from the US to South Africa, where I've worked for the last dozen years, doing a couple of 4-day courses a year. Hadn't been back for a couple of years, and the changes were mind-boggling. The South Africans are now the world leaders in this field. There are composting operations probably on 1 in 5 farms, and I'm talking serious composting operations. There are 20 companies that produce biologicals, usually associated with the university in that country. I was picked up on a private plane and flown to address the farm managers and scientists from ZZ2, who are 90,000 hectares of biological agriculture. I visited the Woolworths stores where we've trained all of the Woolworths growers over 3 years, and I've converted to what's called Farming the Future, the most amazing food that I've ever seen anywhere on the planet, and 20% is actually certified organically, the other 80% is biological. Really, really beautiful quality food. ZZ2, for example, since following these approaches, have taken their grade 1 tomatoes from 21 to 71%, and they're the largest tomato producers in the Southern Hemisphere, using 100 tonnes of compost in some instances to produce 250 tonnes of super high quality tomatoes per hectare, developing all sorts of things like using EM brews with lantana of all things mulched into them, and that one change, this 10-day process, brewing lantana fully mulched with this anaerobic fermented brew, 10 litres twice, takes out their root knot nematodes, which is the most unsustainable of all their chemical practices. So really advanced. We're doing a 4-day course in March at ZZ2, and people will come from all over the world for that. So I then travelled from there to Mauritius, which is a little island about half the size of Tasmania with 1.4 million people. The highest chemical users in the world, and the day that I arrived, the cancer figures came in, the highest cancer rates of anyone in the world. So I speak to the government, I trained their agronomists, I had the last day 2 hours with the Prime Minister. They're funding a 4-day course, and they're really, really right to change. The farmers, the scientists were just basically completely open to something because they recognised beyond doubt that they'd hit the wall with the current practices, and everyone knows someone who's got cancer, and so it's become quite an issue. Worst food I've ever seen anywhere in the world, so a huge contrast from South Africa, with the exception of Romania, which is unbelievably shocking. So we're going to talk about the links between the soil, us, and our planet. One of the things we've seen in almost 20 years now since we started Nutrotech Solutions is that what started as something of a trickle has become a major flow, as evidenced by some of the events I've just described. Some of the reasons that we've seen this switch over to this much more interest in this more sustainable approach, one of the questions, we'll talk about 10 of those reasons quickly before we move into the presentation as such. One of the issues, of course, is the issue of sustainability, and the reality was what I call the chemical experiment, and that's what we need to call this last few decades of extractive agriculture. It has been an experiment. It's not how we always farmed. It's something we have tried, and you could argue we have failed. And the reason for that is that every year since we started, if you check the figures, we've poured more and more chemicals, thrown more and more chemicals at our problems, and every year on a global level, without exception, there's been an overall increase in pest and disease pressure. Last year, 14%, by far the largest single increase in total chemical usage planet-wide in 1 year, and that obviously is a definition of unsustainability. It's a system that's financially and environmentally bankrupt. The other issue, of course, is that there are a couple of major spectres that are, that the whole world is facing in agriculture, probably more so than any other enterprise. One of those is the issue of peak oil and the fact that this is a system completely dependent upon petrochemicals, your fungicides, pesticides, herbicides, nematicides, animal drenches, DAP, MAP, urea, diesel, the whole shooting box is based upon oil. And one of the recent conferences on peak oil, I had a professor, a friend of mine, Ron Lang, speak, and Ron pointed out that in the history of economics, when a non-renewable resource reaches halfway, and we're almost at that point with oil, there's never been an exception. There's been many non-renewable resources that have come and gone prior to now, and every time when at least half of the so-called experts have said, yeah, the first half's gone, the second half the price goes like that, and there's never been an exception. There's never a dip in the price, and of course oil is the only thing that agriculture's facing in relation to that problem with non-renewable resources. There are at least 40% of my estimation of the world currently saying that we've reached peak phosphate now. Some say it happened in 2002. If the current rise, which is a 40% increase in the last 12 months, is a symptom of that, then it's not going to go down. It's not going to do what it did last time and drop again. We're destined to see ever rising prices in phosphate if it mirrors the other non-renewable resources. The other issue, of course, relates to sustainability and the fair question that any society could ask in relation to the success of any system or the success of that society, and that's what do our children inherit? And surprisingly, with this few decades of this chemical experiment, we've done very little research to analyse how the children have been impacted by chemical residues on the food. Understanding that it's okay to say you can get away with 5 parts per million of diocane because it didn't kill a rat or a guinea pig. What happens to that chemical when it enters the human body? Well, the liver is the principal detox organ that must manage it, and it can only manage what it's seen before. It doesn't have a mechanism, in many instances, to remove chemicals that are really man-made chemicals, and so they tend to get shunted off and accumulate in the fat. That's called bioaccumulation. Now, one of the very first studies looking at children and farm chemicals conducted 2.5 years ago in the US, they looked at 1,400 school children, 700 from rural areas, 700 from urban areas, and they looked at the presence of the 13 most commonly used farm chemicals in the tissues of those children. And to the horror of the researchers, they couldn't find a single child who didn't have unacceptable levels of all 13 chemicals in their tissues. So our inheritance, without being too dramatic, to our children is the new disease that's now the major killer of our children, leukemia. There's a leukemia ward in every city now. It's a new disease that's directly linked to this issue and other environmental chemicals. It's not just what's left on our food. And there's other startling new research in the last 6 months linking exposure to farm chemicals to a quite dramatic dumbing down effect on our children in addition to what I just described. The other issue, of course, that we're facing is the issue of climate change, and basically the understanding, if you started looking at those figures, and we will touch on them in a little more depth, assuming there's time, basically it's about putting CO2 in the soil as humus. And the simple, if you understand the importance of that, the single most important thing, actually the only thing that will work in time, as I'll point out later, but the thing to recognise here is that humus building is not something you can do from a bag. Humus building is a biological process, and when you look at the analysis of how that works, we find that many of the chemicals used in extractive agriculture for the last few decades are counterproductive in that regard, and so they're not going to be acceptable at some point, and that will come down to a legislative thing in years to come. The other thing that's sort of changed in the last decade is a recognition that the soil isn't just something to stand the plant up, that it contains trillions of microorganisms, that it really is a system that if we look after it, it looks after us. And now that we've started looking to see how we've looked after it in terms of soil life analysis, we've realised that we've decimated some of the key creatures in the soil, and we'll touch upon some of those as we move. Much more soil and plant testing to get into a more kind of prescriptive nutritional approach to agriculture has shown serious mineral imbalances. We work in 47 countries and we do soil tests and leaf tests with a team of agronomists in those countries, and it's widespread, it's everywhere. Not just deficiencies, but imbalances. Too much of one thing that always impacts the uptake of another mineral. No mineral, of course, is an island, and everything impacts 1, 2, 3, in the case of calcium, 7 or 8 different minerals if you have that mineral out of balance. One of the other issues, of course, is the fact that we need to inspire a new generation of food producers. I was amazed in South Africa where, you know, it's a fairly rugged kind of journey to remain in agriculture, with the uncertainty of the potential that maybe they'll go the way that Zimbabwe went, where 4,000 farmers have been killed in the last 6 years in their paddocks. And yet at least half of the talks, and they were all sold out, and I got standing ovations at every seminar on this most recent tour, where they herald me as the father of, maybe I'm getting older, father of biological agriculture. I've been there so often and in so many of these talks there. But young people, passionate, excited young people, in the face of enormous odds, are rolling into agriculture, and part of what's driving it is this, the fact that you've got to be inspired. There's no passion in poisons. No one enjoys putting on their sweat-soaked spacesuit and poisoning the food they're selling in their entire working environment. They think that it's a necessity. The reality is that we're not going to inspire. Monoculture and chemical agriculture is not going to inspire a new breed of food producers, and we need to do that. The average age of farmers is 62 years in this country. It's 65 years in the US. We need new blood to produce our food, and they need to be inspired. There's also a worldwide movement, and this was the reason, so I was told by the head of the Dole Corporation, for their change. Part of the reason was the recognition that there was some hard science behind it and that it was possible, and that we've been doing it along with many other companies all over the world for quite some time. But increasingly there's a demand from the consumers that they want to know where their food comes from. They want to know what's in the food and how that food was produced. And the Japanese, for example, call it kelso, which means putting a face to your food. They've started a whole chain of wholesaler supermarkets, the direct relationship between the farmer and the consumer. In every town now in Japan you can go there, big photo of the person who produced the food, the story of the family or the food producer. And it really is self-policing, because if you don't deliver, if you just produce a load of crap, which you could do and get away with the current system where your food got bundled in with everyone else's, regardless of the quality of it, now everyone puts a face to their food and they say, well, that's no good, I'm not going back there. And very soon you sort out the wheat from the chaff, as they've discovered in Japan. It's made a huge difference to food quality when you put a face to the food and develop a closer link to food producers. The loss of soil structure, the loss of resilience has marked the march of extractive agriculture. It's way past time for a change. So we're talking soils, we're talking humans, and we're talking planet and health of the planet. The simple, very simple, almost cliched statement is we are what we eat, but we are what we eat comes from the soil. And the healthier the soil, the hardier the people, the lower the pollution, and as I'll point out, the happier the planet. A healthy soil is a soil that can breathe freely. So we're going to talk for a little bit about the parameters of soil health. And probably the most important of those, when we recognise that we're talking about a biological system, is that the majority of these creatures are aerobic and they need to breathe. And so getting critical ratios like the calcium to magnesium ratio, for example, correct, is about opening that soil and allowing the soil to breathe. And we talk about breathing, we're talking about breathing in oxygen, and then when you breathe out, just as we do, you breathe out CO2, and that CO2 oozes from the root zone, from the microorganisms and the roots that have used oxygen and breathed out CO2, and the CO2 is captured on the little pores on the underside of the leaf, and so begins the most important process on the planet, the only source of food on the planet is a green plant. You might say, I eat meat. Well, the meat eats green plants. And green plants are based upon this almost miraculous process of photosynthesis. And that's all about how well the soil breathes, is how well you photosynthesize, and how much profit you make, and how much you produce, and the quality of what you produce is all based upon that simple concept, which is linked to mineral balance and microbial support. It's always about microbes and minerals. Exactly the same parallel exists in your gut. Your 30-foot tube that runs between your mouth and your anus should contain 100 trillion microorganisms, 10 times more than the total number of cells in your body, weighing slightly more than your liver, and we've assaulted that system to the extent that digestive illness is the single largest class of illness, and there's a whole lot of, related problems, and the fact that you're not digesting correctly and not taking in the nutrients that support your immune system and so forth. It links to everything in actual fact. Tremendous parallel, and we've done the same thing to our gut as what we've done to our soils, and we're increasingly recognising the need for a change. It basically, if we look at it, and we talk about this from a hard science perspective, if you look up Webster's dictionary and the definition of the word science, the definition of science in that dictionary is adherence to natural laws and principles. And a huge amount of what we've done in the name of medical science and veterinary science and agricultural science has been anything but that when we start recognising particularly this biological link. So what are the 7 secrets of a good soil? Well, it should contain ideally 5% humus. That was the average some 10 decades ago. We're now on a global level down to 1.5%. We've lost over 2/3 of that. We've talked, and you guys will talk more about compost and green manure and things called humates that can help to achieve that 5% and to reclaim that 5% humus. Soil health also, as we mentioned, is about minerals and microbes. It's about having the ratios correct between certain minerals because that's what allows them to perform to their optimum. And of course, a healthy soil must have this fully functioning soil food web. The actinomycetes that give the delicious smell to the soil, the visible fungi, the operational nodules on legumes, and perhaps most importantly of all, earthworms. I ask at talks all over the world how many of you still got reasonable numbers of earthworms in your soil. The holy grail of biological agriculture is to have 25 earthworms in a shovelful. 25 earthworms in a shovelful in terms of castings is 300 tonnes per hectare of castings per year. You really don't need any more inputs once you've achieved that holy grail. Earthworms, of course, involved in the shredding of organic matter, the aeration of the soil, the aggregation of soil particles, the distribution of microbes and minerals. They go down and bring minerals up. They produce their own organisms in their gut that you can't get from elsewhere. The vermicast itself is a remarkable, almost inexplicable byproduct of the earthworm. 7 times more phosphorus, 10 times more potassium, 5 times more nitrogen, 3 times more magnesium, and 1.5 times more calcium than the surrounding soil. And sometimes you can't even explain how that's possible when you analyse the surrounding soil. Earthworms have got an inbuilt colloid mill. It reduces particle size. The digestion is not based on enzymes as our digestive system is based upon. Instead, they incubate their own organisms and the organisms do the work. And as we said, basically, if you can get your 25 earthworms per shovelful at any time during the year, on an average across your property, not that easy, but I have seen it, and at that point, you're producing 300 tonnes of castings, and at a really cheap price of saying $100 a tonne, which really you could never buy earthworm castings for anything like that, but assuming it was as cheap as that, $30,000 worth of free fertiliser, why on earth would you need any more inputs at that point? To bring those earthworms back into your soil, you need to have fungi, you need to have protozoa. Protozoa, for example, are one of the key, almost champagne foods for earthworms. Just talking quickly about protozoa, we're talking about a watermelon-sized creature eating 10,000 pea-sized bacteria. Critically important to recycle the nitrogen out of this nitrogen-intensive little creature called a bacteria. The protozoa are basically spitting out what they don't need and supplying that nitrogen and recycling that nitrogen, and fairly important process in the soil. Hugely popular from the earthworm's perspective. They love to eat protozoa. One of the things that we teach amongst many is the concept of how to make a lucerne tea. Very simple idea. For some reason, all three species of protozoa are found in lucerne. You can aerate with something like fish or whatever to feed up. Fish seems to work particularly well if it contains the oil. And use in this very simple 200 litre recipe there, you can do a 1,000 or a 10,000 litre recipe. But you'll notice that, if you even trial it on your home garden with a 20-litre bucket, you'll notice the earthworms come within a week from wherever. And I did it recently just as a little trial and doubled the earthworm counts in my own raised beds at home. Other secrets of the soil, pH of the soil should be 6.4. 6.4 is where everything happens. It's the pH that facilitates maximum nutrient uptake. Interestingly, we talk about the new concept of measuring plant sap, and 6.4 happens to be the figure where the plant's most healthy and most resilient. We'll often test a urine pH during our 4-day courses as a test of your acid-alkaline balance, and 6.4 first thing in the morning is where your urine should be. A very simple process of mixing deionised water 50-50 with the soil, 5 minutes wait, and then dipping in your pH meter or your pH strip. One of the little trace minerals, and we look at the whole spectrum of trace minerals, but one of them is very often missing and very often not tested on a soil test, is a little trace mineral called molybdenum, and I've actually put it in my 7 secrets because I feel it's so sort of ignored. Principally, there are a couple of things involved with molybdenum that are hugely important. One is our access to the 74,000 tonnes if we're going to talk about reducing our reliance upon petrochemicals, and most specifically nitrogen, there has to be a recognition, well, how did some of the most productive areas in the history of mankind, areas like the Great Plains, which for thousands of years outproduced in total biomass anything that we've done to this point, how did they get their nitrogen? Nitrogen is the most abundant and most important mineral to produce those kind of yields. And of course, how that system operated, a large percentage of that nitrogen was accessed from where it was supposed to be accessed, from the free gift in the atmosphere. 74,000 tonnes of nitrogen gas hovers above every hectare. It's there for the taking. You need to have a little bit of a recipe in place to access that free gift. One of the critical components of that recipe is, on our tests anyway, a 0.5 parts per million of molybdenum, this little trace mineral. Why? Because the enzyme that the nitrogen-fixing organisms, both the organisms that live in the nodules on legumes and the free-living nitrogens, organisms that crowd around the plant roots, they need to have, to produce an enzyme called nitrogenase to access that gas and convert it to ammonium nitrogen in the soil. And there's a key trace mineral that's required to produce nitrogenase, that enzyme, and that trace mineral is molybdenum. Most of the soil tests that we check are molybdenum deficient. It only takes a couple of cups to correct that situation, but it's very often not there. That's the first stage for molybdenum. Fairly important to give you access to the free gift. The second, equally important, particularly when we talk about human health, is the role of molybdenum in converting the nitrogen, very commonly nitrate nitrogen that's stored in the leaf of the plant, and converting that nitrogen through to proteins, which are what we're trying to eat as human beings, and hopefully our livestock are consuming protein rather than nitrates that have yet to be converted. Now, nitrates again require an enzyme for that conversion process. That enzyme is called the nitrate reductase enzyme, and that enzyme is based upon this little trace mineral that's lacking in most soils called molybdenum. So understand, in the absence of that little trace mineral, we're eating food packed with nitrates. There are over 200 papers linking nitrates to cancer. Nitrates reduce the capacity of the blood to carry oxygen. Professor Otto Warburg won his Nobel Prize for identifying the root cause of cancer, anaerobism, the capacity of the body to deliver enough oxygen to enough cells, in a very simple summarised version. Hugely important that we don't have too much nitrates in our diet. We're going to have them if we don't have this little trace mineral called molybdenum. Our livestock are going to be consuming too high levels of nitrates, and all of us will be doing the same. When we talk about little trace minerals, people think of them as an obscure, insignificant thing in some instances. Here's some work from the New Zealand Ag Department. Increases by adding 1 cup of sodium molybdate to the single super fertiliser. In this trial involving lucent and rape on 2 different soil types, clay and sandstone, the smallest increase in this instance was 38%, the largest 603% from 1 cup of sodium molybdate. So that's the difference. In this instance, obviously the missing link. Everything else must have been pretty right, but they weren't accessing that free gift, that 74,000 tonnes of nitrogen gas that's there for the taking if you have the recipe in place. So a healthy soil should have a crumb structure. It should require very little digging. Crumb structure means that oxygen and moisture can enter easily, that the plant roots can develop unimpeded, that earthworms and beneficial nematodes can travel freely. It can only come from biology. It's not something you can buy from a bag. Bacteria create little mini aggregates with their sticky alkaline slime, and those aggregates are then wound up and bound together with the hyphae of fungi to create larger soil particles. One of the ways that you could sponsor crumb structure, we've found, is the use of humates. They're an amazing, or brewing up your own microorganisms, compost tea, or in our case we use a product called 420, which can have quite a remarkable effect on soil structure. A healthy soil should be self-protective. And of course that's critical if we're trying to minimise the use of chemicals and chemical intervention. And self-protection, just like with humans, involves a two-part equation. It involves minerals and microorganisms. Protective microbes can be introduced obviously through compost, or a sort of probably more cost-effective but probably not quite as effective concept where you take a little bit of compost and produce something called compost tea. You can also introduce protective species like trichoderma, which we've found you can also brew and put out there very, very inexpensively for disease control, for cellulose digestion, and this creature also produces a plant growth stimulant, which can give you quite a kick for a minimum investment. One of the other key attributes of a self-protective soil is to have enough silica present in that soil. And the relatively new finding that we need 100 parts per million of soluble silica in a soil that's filled with silica, because the sands are silicas, the clays are aluminosilicates. Why would we need more? Well, when we start soil testing, we find that something we've done, and no one has quite really worked out what it is, has affected the microorganisms that make silica into a plant-available form. And without silica, there is a tremendous compromising of plant resilience. Why? Because basically, if you look at a disease, for example, you've got a fungi driving its hyphae through quite a substantial cell wall to get to the yolk in the centre of the cell, and the moment it's there, it can fund cell division, which spreads your disease, whatever that fungal disease may be. And so the obvious proactive approach here is, how do we build that cell wall to buckle the hyphae and to stop that process, which is an obvious proactive Well, what's the cell wall composed of? It's composed of calcium and silica. So they become hugely important in terms of building a protective plant. Silica, as I said, most soils have got about 20 parts per million, you need 100 parts per million. Hugh talks at length about how you can utilise a trace mineral called boron to help the solubilisation of silica, and perhaps he'll touch upon that if anyone you want to talk about his theories in relation to that. We've found that they are particularly valid. It's a very good approach in late winter to come in and spray some boron and to get some silica moving into the plant and open up the pathways and nutrient translocation within the plant are silica based, because phloem and xylem, the sort of highways into the plant and around the plant, are made from silica. So the more that we can improve silica uptake, the better nutrient translocation, the better the uptake particularly of calcium into those plants. Building self-protective soils also involves a creature called mycorrhizal fungi, and we can see here, that's little yellow thing, if you can see here, is the base root, and this tag-on 1,000% increase in root surface area is what mycorrhizal fungi offer when they burrow into that plant root and expand the potential. Everything that a plant root does now can be achieved at 10 times what was originally achieved, theoretically. We now know that this hugely important creature is actually responsible for 30% of all the soil humus. Sarah Wright made the discovery in 1996 of a sticky substance called glomalin that's produced by the glomallis, the most common strain of mycorrhizal fungi, and we now know that glomalin's a trigger that governs the production of humus to the extent of almost a third of all the humus in the soil. In fact, the decline in our humus from 5% down to 1.5% can be directly linked to the decline of mycorrhizal fungi, who are now down to just 9% of what they were a few short decades ago before we began this process of extractive agriculture. So their loss has a huge impact upon soil health, human health, and planetary health. If we look at the picture of mycorrhizal fungi, they do more than just build humus. They offer a huge range of benefits. They allow access to immobile minerals like phosphorus and zinc, are two of the ones they're quite famous for. They help deliver that all-important calcium to the plant. They help deliver hard-to-access potassium. They produce biochemicals. There's some really impressive new research showing this tremendous boost to plant immunity if you've got mycorrhizal colonisation. They create an impenetrable maze of filaments that dissuade nematodes, both with the production of a biochemical that puts them off and just the physical process of getting to the root when you've got mycorrhizal colonisation. They work in concert with nitrogen-fixing organisms to magnify their effect. In our instance, one of the most exciting things that we've come across in the last 2 decades has been this, actually produced by a South African woman who's worked for the last 50 years on mycorrhizal fungi, worked out a way to produce them faster and to harvest them less expensively, because they're quite an energy-intensive process to harvest each little spore off the roots. You can't brew them up and so forth. And she's produced a product that has turned into our largest selling product in the world in a quite short time. You can, in Broadacre, put just $5 worth of this material and get colonisation of your crop in that season. In horticulture, they use $20. So it becomes something that anyone can achieve, which is quite exciting in terms of the importance of using these creatures to build humus, aside from the other benefits. How healthy are our food-producing soils? The vast majority of the thousands of soils we test around the globe are deficient in minerals and the microorganisms that deliver those minerals. As I said, every year since we started, we've put on more chemicals. It is the very definition of unsustainable. We mined the soil for decades with quite a simplistic concept. I mean, it's not hard to realise from a pure common sense perspective. Every time you take off a crop, it contains a fraction of everything that was in the soil. And if the first cell that oozed from the Precambrian ocean contained 74 minerals, and many of those minerals were present in the soil, and nothing happens accidentally in the perfect blueprint. And then for 10 decades, we took off everything and put just 3 things back, and what on earth did we think was going to happen when this is the food that we eat, and the food that we eat needs that mineral support, and our bodies require that broad spectrum mineral support, and we come up with this really stupid idea of putting 3 things back and taking everything out for decades and decades and decades. We cultivated and irrigated to promote leaching and erosion and speed up that loss of mineralisation, lost 2/3 of our humus, and of course the mineral balance that determines nutrient availability was ignored for many decades. It wasn't even recognised as a reality, and in many cases excess is having too much nitrogen or too much potassium or too much calcium even for that matter can actually be worse than a deficiency. And then of course the salt fertilisers have added insult to injury in terms of soil life destruction. The health of our children, we mentioned that figure, that horror show figure. They couldn't find one child, according to FDA standards, who didn't have unacceptable levels of all of the 13 farm chemicals. This is the first generation in human history who are expected to live longer than their children. That's never happened. The children always move 2 or 3 years further on in terms of their life expectancy for the first time, and we're seeing that because it's a progressive degenerative effect upon our children. We're seeing, if you think back to your childhood, if you're my age, I think back to my years at that point in New Zealand, we had one child in the class with glasses, we had one child in the school with braces, and they both got called rather miserable names. My son's generation, it's 1 and 3 with glasses and 1 and 2 with braces. Braces, if we're talking about degeneration, the need for braces is about your jaw not having the nutrition to fill out to the point that your teeth can fit in that jaw comfortably. That's what the need for braces is based upon. And so we're seeing this progressive degeneration that we could have picked up if we'd looked at Francis Pottinger's work with the 900 cats that he's written quite a famous book about, where he took 900 cats, he'd fed half of those cats fully processed food, food from a can, fruit from a biscuit, heated food that contained no enzymes, and he marked the progress of the food, the cats that ate raw milk and raw meat, which is what cats were obviously designed to do, and he saw this unbelievable degeneration to the point that by the 3rd generation, half of the kittens died and the other half, no kitten lasted more than a month. The degeneration happened that quickly when you ate nothing but dead processed food. And of course we've done that on a far less dramatic scale with our children, and the decline in the nutritional value of our food over several generations. In a comprehensive study called Nutrition and Disease, the World Health Organization couldn't find a single disease that didn't have a nutrition link. They also developed what they called, or discovered or identified what they termed type A malnutrition in much of the developing world, and they found that most of the rest of us suffer from something called type B malnutrition. It's suggested by nutritionists now that the food that we consume contains just 20% of the nutrition that was found in the food that our grandparents ate when they were children. So we lost 80% in 3 short generations. And several things have contributed to that. It matters how we grow our food. Here's a UK study. It's not sufficient to say I ate an orange this morning, I squeezed an orange for some juice this morning, so I got my vitamin C. Look at the research. It all depends on how you grow that orange. In the case of the UK research, they found quite a number of oranges that actually contained 0 vitamin C. 0 milligrams per 100 grams of vitamin C. When you chuck a bit of urea and ignore everything else onto that citrus crop, the production of phytonutrients, which include all the key vitamins and all the antioxidant vitamins, is based upon how you grow the crop. Everything comes from a mineral base. And you don't put the minerals on, you just chuck a bit of nitrogen on, you don't get very good food. Poor old Popeye would have had to have actually popped 1,580 cans of spinach to pop up his muscles in relation to this 0.1 of a milligram per 100 grams found in some instances of spinach. Huge variations based upon how that food was grown. We talked about some of the research, and I've got to move through to try and cover the sort of things I need to cover, but big drop-offs are monitored and measured by several commentators over the last 10 decades. One of the solutions, if you can't access decent food, is to at least grow your own food. If you can't do it yourself, pay a retired person or enlist your children or something. Getting children to grow food is actually a neat concept. Pay them for the vegetables at market prices. Suite of benefits come from that. There's no greater gift from a parent to a child than to encourage a love of the soil and of home food production. The kids can develop entrepreneurial skills. They can look at that row of radish and say, yeah, that's of carrots, for example, say, yeah, I reckon there's 40 kilos in there at $3 a kilo, 120 bucks towards my new PlayStation, unfortunately. But at least you've got them out there. They discover a love and appreciation of nature, the sacred production of food. It's always been a sacred thing until we sort of bastardised that concept in the last few decades. Exercise and fresh air punctuated by nutritious vegetable snacks is a pretty good way to go. One of the things we developed is a home garden process called the Life Force Vegetable Vitality System, a real simple 5-stage process. I did it for the first time after developing it, came home from a world tour, and that's what my garden looked like, and it looks very similar to that at the moment. When I just saw it yesterday for the first time back, I got back the night before last. Amazing tasting food, ridiculously high Brix levels, tremendous if you're into green smoothies. If we get a chance, I'll talk about how incredibly important health-finding green smoothies are and why. There's a remarkable parallel between soil health and human health. We talked about the 100 trillion organisms. One of the things that we encourage at the many health talks I do around the world is the production of lacto-fermented food, because you're basically introducing this probiotic on a daily basis. All of the long-living cultures, when you look at nutritional anthropology, have consumed lacto-fermented foods, and you can lacto-ferment anything. Obvious things are sauerkraut and so forth. One of the things we use is this product of ours called BioBubble, which is one of our largest selling health products. 40 billion organisms per 50 ml serve, and we use that to make a 3-day sauerkraut that's jam-packed with these organisms that's absolutely delicious. One of the things when we start looking at minerals, and we do that as part of our 4-day course, you get a full hair test and we analyse where you're at from a mineral perspective. I just better keep an eye on my time here. Okay. We find that basically if you want to simplify it down and not go and have your tests, where really you've got a short life, you wouldn't grow a crop without doing a soil test. It's really of benefit for most people to do some analysis and find out what they need rather than blindly walking into the ever-burgeoning health food and chemist shops and buying a hit-and-miss approach at addressing your own nutrition. We need to have a little bit more informed nutrition, in my opinion. But 3 things that you can be fairly sure that you're deficient in, because almost everyone we test is, are the 3 minerals, selenium, zinc and magnesium. Now, the CSIRO in Virginia in South Australia 2 years ago tested food for selenium in that region, couldn't find a single part per billion testing food 5 days a week for 6 months. Not 1 part per million of selenium in anything produced in that region. Doesn't mean the whole country is quite that deficient, but we are the 2nd lowest levels of selenium in the world. Hugely important for detoxification. It's probably the single most important mineral, or right up there in terms of your liver, and the liver is the principal detoxification organ. If you're a smoker, then you've got absolutely essential requirement to start taking and supplementing with selenium. But all of us, in actual fact, in my opinion, should be having our 200 micrograms of selenium on a daily basis. Selenium partners with a group of amino acids called glutathione and produces an enzyme system called glutathione peroxidase, probably the most protective enzyme system, certainly for some of the cancers, including lymphatic cancers, absolutely critically important. I actually can talk for half a day on selenium. We haven't got time. I'll keep moving. Zinc is the second one. Zinc, absolutely essential for immunity. That's why you buy your vitamin C and zinc tablets when you've got the flu or colds and so forth. Accumulates in the thymus gland, which is responsible for production of killer T cells. A 10% deficiency of zinc, and most people are much more deficient than that in zinc when we do the testing. But even a 10% deficiency of zinc is enough to compromise your immunity. Then we look at prostate health, and we see what has now become the largest killer of Australian men. Prostate cancer took over about 7 months ago from heart disease as the largest killer of Australian men. And we find that zinc is a hugely important mineral in the health of that gland. 7 times more zinc in a healthy prostate gland compared to a sick one. It's actually the most important nutrient for both prostate and breast health, and breast health is the second largest killer of our women. Also critically important for mental health, for brain development, particularly in children, required by multiple enzyme systems, and it's one of those key minerals for the health of the thyroid gland, along with selenium and of course iodine. Symptoms of a zinc deficiency. Now, when you get down to this very common symptom where you've got the white blotches, you're actually very, very zinc deficient and quite immune compromised at this point. You need to be aware if you're looking down at your nails and you've got any white spots. Those are some of the symptoms. Emotional instability, infertility, low testosterone, fairly important in its own right when we look at the importance from muscle integrity, that this testosterone, not just sex drive, testosterone is all about muscle integrity. You've got one muscle that you want to keep the integrity of, and testosterone requires zinc to be produced, and so very commonly linked to zinc deficiencies is low testosterone and all of the problems that come with that. Reasons for zinc deficiency, well, a lot of our soils, particularly the broadacre soils, are zinc deficient. Vegetarianism, zinc is much more better absorbed from animal sources. One of the key processes is that we weren't really designed to eat the level of cereal grains. No organism was designed to have wheat bix for breakfast, followed by toast, followed by pikelets for morning tea, a roll or a sandwich at lunch, a cake for afternoon tea, and pasta for evening meal. Many allergists will tell you, and food sensitivity people will tell you that many people don't even recognise it, but their inflammation, which of course is linked to all diseases can be linked to a wheat intolerance, not gluten intolerance, but a wheat intolerance, because we were never designed to eat that level of grains. All cereal grains contain a natural acid called phytic acid. Phytic acid combines with zinc and forms a zinc phytate, which is insoluble. So even if you're taking zinc in the morning, you're not absorbing that zinc if you're eating your wheat bix and your sandwiches and the normal things that people consume. One of the things that you do is take your zinc supplement, which every man and probably everyone in the room should consider, have that supplement bottle sitting beside your bed and take it last thing before bed. I won't go through that. You can see the stuff on the side, except for perhaps touching upon one of the many reasons for zinc deficiency is malabsorption, and malabsorption is very often linked to a shortage for hydrochloric acid, which requires zinc to be produced. And hydrochloric acid shortage is exactly the same symptoms as having too much acid. And your test for finding out, if you're deficient of hydrochloric acid, you're not breaking down proteins into amino acids, you're not absorbing minerals from the food, there's a whole range of issues linked to the subsequent malabsorption. Your test is very simple. When you get the digestive discomfort, you have a couple of teaspoons of vinegar and you pour it back with a bit of water. And if you get an increased acidity and increased discomfort, well then you just take an antacid. If it relieves that discomfort you've discovered, and it might be as high as 20% of people over 50 they're now suggesting, you may have a deficiency of hydrochloric acid. Do something about it. Start taking some zinc amongst other things, but get some betaine hydrochloride from the chemist shop or the health food shop and correct that shortage, because it is quite serious. Okay, talking about zinc and natural sources of zinc. Oysters have got their sexual reputation because they're by far the highest source of zinc. From a plant source, pumpkin seeds are a great concept. Brazil nuts are the highest natural source of selenium, and the third highest natural source of zinc, and the fourth highest natural source of magnesium, which many of us are also deficient in. As I mentioned, last thing before bed is the trick when supplementing with zinc, so that it doesn't mix with your phytic acid and become insoluble. We won't talk too much more on that. That's just talking about zinc and selenium. Our particular, just a little moment of advertising there. I spent quite a lot of work developing this. We've had tremendous feedback from around the world from people with prostate problems, particularly enlarged prostate. 32 ingredients, including a trio of amino acids that have been hugely successful in the Japanese research in reducing enlarged prostate. A whole range of herbs and anti-inflammatories and antioxidants, and of course the prescribed amount in a teaspoon of zinc and selenium for the health of your prostate. Magnesium, basically I call it the master mineral. I do a whole day talking on magnesium just to give you some concept of the importance of this mineral that some 80%, 75 to 80% of us are deficient in. Linked to every aspect of health, every aspect of longevity. Reasons for the large scale, again, phytic acid forms a magnesium phytate. So the phytic acid in cereal grains, leaching during cooking, perspiration losses very commonly if you're working outside. Phosphoric acid in soft drinks combines and forms an insoluble magnesium phosphate, and acidity generally. Stress is a big player. Basically, we were designed to have a flight-or-fight response. We walk out of the cave, there's a saber-toothed tiger, everything changes. We either fight, which we didn't very often win, or we run like hell, which we often didn't escape. But that response, the flight-or-fight response, has been retained and is there at varying levels in most of us. Because I ask the question wherever I travel, I say, how many, and I'll ask this question now just out of interest, how many amongst you can say in all honesty that you don't feel low levels of anxiety on a regular basis that you'd rather not feel? Can anyone raise their hand? And that, how many amongst you can say that you don't feel anxiety on a regular basis that you'd rather not feel? And that is the picture of the world. It doesn't matter where you travel, the figure is about 1 in 50, so it's 2% of people. And then you wonder if they're a lying bastard or not when they put their hand up. But there's not many of us who are not stressed. We've created an insanely stressful world, and the biggest thing that's drawn in those stressed conditions is your magnesium reserves, and also B5 and B6. And so it's three things that almost everyone perhaps consider addressing in relation to the fact that we're all obviously stressed. And when you're stressed, constantly you're drawing upon magnesium, because every aspect of that flight-or-fight response is magnesium driven. Calcium supplementation, many people have cottoned on to the need to increase bone density and avoid another plague disease called osteoporosis, but in the absence of nutritional understanding, and most of our doctors do, I'm sure as Ray will confirm, just an hour of nutrition in a 7-year degree, taking calcium, when the most important ratio in the human body is the calcium to magnesium ratio, and almost everyone is magnesium deficient, taking calcium without magnesium, as many people are advised to do, is actually worse than not taking calcium, because you're worsening that all-important ratio. And what happens is that calcium actually enters the cell, which magnesium is supposed to dominate, creates calcification, which is linked to atherosclerosis and a range of other problems. So you don't take calcium without magnesium is the message. Here's the symptoms, and probably it's better to tick boxes or go on and do online quizzes to determine your likelihood of magnesium deficiency, because only 1% of the magnesium is found in the blood, and it's not a particularly reliable way to measure your magnesium status. But so you could check it, you could look at that list of insomnia, irritability, everything to do with the heart, from angina to rapid heartbeat to arrhythmia and so forth, seizures, cramps very commonly, muscle weakness, high blood pressure. I had two people at every talk in South Africa on average. I did the sums, there were about a dozen over 5 talks, who came up and said that it was all actually in 2 regions where there were doctors that understood nutrition in that country who had taken them off the blood pressure medication after testing for magnesium, finding they were magnesium deficient, correcting that deficiency, and the blood pressure returned to normal. Hugely, massively linked to hypertension. If you've got high blood pressure, you need to address or check your magnesium levels before you go on to a lifetime of medication, which you never get off, unfortunately. You can see the things, the largest killer, coronary heart disease, asthma, osteoporosis, depression, massively linked to depression, migraine headaches. There are 17 published papers linking magnesium to migraines and so forth. The 12 key roles of magnesium, you can see it: heart disease, mental health, enzyme activation, 350 enzymes directly dependent upon magnesium. Muscle function, 27% of the magnesium is found in the myosin, the muscle cells. Regulating blood sugar, detoxification, immunity, strong bones, arterial stress, stroke, hypertension, all linked If we're going to be proactive, why wouldn't we at a governmental level say, look, everyone's got to supplement with magnesium when we've got what we call, this health crisis on the place at the moment? How do you address it? One of the issues, if you're really deficient, is that you can lose the capacity of your gut to absorb magnesium. So you can have injections, you can have intravenous magnesium, muscular injections and so forth. One of the exciting things in recent years has been this discovery of what they call magnesium oil. It's a form of pristine magnesium chloride that feels oily, it's not actually an oil, and you spray it on your skin. And the suggestion is that you can get 10 times better absorption of magnesium when you bypass the gut and go straight through your skin, straight into your blood. But a recognition of how well and how easily the skin absorbs is hugely important for farmers, because you're out there, I see people out there with their shorts on, even the home gardeners spraying their glyphosate and so forth. And if you don't realise or believe how well your skin absorbs, here's a little test for you. Take a garlic clove, give it a bang so there's some juice coming out of it, put it on a plaster and stick it on the underneath of your foot and wait. It takes 11 and a half minutes. I've timed it myself, well, that's how long it took for me. And your mouth is flooded with the flavour of garlic. It's gone through your entire system in that short a time, and you need to be aware of that when you're using farm chemicals in terms of how easily they're going to enter your body via your skin. So that's just talking about MagSorb. Thanks, Rhonda. How happy is the planet? It took us till 1900 to get to 1 billion people, and then we went a little crazy from that point on. Most of the changes happened in what I call the post-war party fueled by cheap oil, and basically we're now, the suggestion is that global warming is the greatest crisis in mankind's history. Here's the post-war party. You can look at those charts and see the increases, all of them beginning, population, or the whole range of things here. You can see the charts yourself. We haven't got time because I've only got 5 minutes. I'm going to move quick now, as if I haven't been already. And so you'll see the change. Everything spikes from 1950. This is the post-war party fueled by cheap oil, where everything, including population, has gone ballistic. So that's the change in human enterprise from 1750 to 2000. There's the hangover, the responses to the global environment to the accelerating human enterprises, and of course everything changes from 1950. Is that all a coincidence? Of course it's not. We created the problem and we need to do something about it. One of the issues is what the climatologists call positive feedback. Forests and wooded areas are carbon sinks. They absorb carbon, release oxygen. As the tree numbers and average size decline, so does the potential to recycle. Droughts linked to global warming increase bushfires, and of course that releases huge amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, and we have this global heating phenomenon linked to it. This is talking about methane. I'm going to flick through these slides. Basically, one of the issues is that more than half of the known methane is found in these mountains of sludge beneath the ocean at 500 metres down and deeper that are actually quite sensitive and only stay stable under high pressure and low temperature, and the temperatures have just started to increase at that level, and there's a tremendous fear that we're going to release this huge flood of methane into the atmosphere if we don't do something about it and change that equation. Nitrous oxide, of course, is the other greenhouse gas aside from methane and CO2, but agriculture produces 80% of the nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. It's 310 times more potent as a thickening agent of that blanket that traps the heat and changes the climate, so it's no small thing. Mismanagement of nitrogen has generated more than nitrous oxide. It's one of the reasons that we're down to, we've lost 3.5% from 5 to 1.5% is linked. Here's quickly how that works. I think I'm not going to tell that story, I'll keep on moving. James Hansen just talked, this bloke, James Hansen, is probably in the top 5. Some would say he's number 1 in terms of climate scientists. He's a NASA scientist. His predictions have been insanely accurate. I mean, Michael Oppenheimer, who's written several climate change studies, says of Hansen, his science is impeccable, his prescience is unparalleled. He hasn't actually been wrong to this point, this bloke, to give you an idea of the urgency of the need for change. He's saying that the planet's the hottest it's been for 1 million years. He believes that we've got until 2015 to initiate huge changes in energy management and, of course, in farming, or we cross a threshold and create what he describes as a very different planet that most of us would wish hadn't happened. The other issue that's actually probably more important in terms of urgency than the warming of the planet is the acidification of the oceans. And the reason for this, I actually heard Australian, when I was travelling somewhere recently, scientists talking about their just completed research, and he burst into tears to describe that research when he said, okay, at the current rate of acidification, when do we start knocking out the algae and krill, the basis of all ocean life? Everything's based upon this huge body of biomass linked to algae and krill. And he found that, is it 500, 5,000, 50,000 years until we knock them out? And he burst into tears when he described their research, suggested 20 years, we've got no algae and krill, theoretically no ocean, and theoretically no human beings. So it doesn't get much more dramatic than that in terms of urgency. The acidity and the acidification of the ocean, the inability of calcium-based life forms to produce that life and that ongoing thing from coral to algae and krill and shellfish and so forth, crustaceans and so forth, as you build up, all of the oceans have absorbed, in the southern oceans, half of all of the CO2 that's been produced by us, and it creates carbonic acid. And carbonic acid in the ocean makes it impossible for these calcium creatures over time to continue life. And so it's a serious issue that we need to address. Humus is the solution. All the emphasis to this point has been developing alternatives to burning coal, and including wind and solar power and so forth. At some point we need to recognise how important that a great deal of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere came from the soil, and that's where we need to put it back, and we need to do that really urgently. Here's the figures. Since the Industrial Revolution, since 1860, 476 billion tonnes, 476 gigatons used to be in the soil, is now in the atmosphere. And at that same time, everything else that we've done, which is motor vehicles, industrial emissions, the whole shooting box, 270 gigatons. Most of what's in the atmosphere, the offending extra increase in the atmosphere, is linked to what came from the soil, and we need to change that. Here we see the storage, and you can see the amount that should be stored in the soil, or that is currently stored in the soil despite the losses, versus the other two storage points for carbon, the biomass and the atmosphere. The soil's where most of it's stored, the soil's where we've got to put it back. Can it happen? Well, there's 30 billion tonnes of CO2 going into the atmosphere each year. The Americans produce 8 billion of that. If the Americans were to do 1% organic matter a year on just their cultivated land, that pulls back 4.5 billion that would have otherwise gone to the atmosphere of that 8 billion. That's more than what we need to do. Farmers are literally the only enterprise capable of basically saving the place in time, and there is only one way you can do that, and that's with biological agriculture. What does it mean from your perspective to be paid carbon credits, which will have to happen by next year or we're in trouble? Water, for example, this is a real win-win situation. Water has become our most precious commodity. 74% of the earth's covered by water, only 3% of that's fresh, 90% of that's used for irrigation. Organic matter is by far the most efficient way to store water. You put water in a dam like this, massive amounts of evaporation, a huge carbon footprint to pump it to wherever you're going to put it out. You put it through your centre pivots or whatever, there's another big loss for evaporation and the carbon footprint in pumping it, versus storing it right on the soil. 1% of organic matter increased in your soil means that you can store 170,000 litres of water per hectare that you couldn't store previously. It can't evaporate, the plant takes it right beside the roots whenever it needs to. There's no more efficient way. Taking it down to a smaller level, twice the size of this table, is 17 litres that can now be stored. 2 5-litre buckets plus a half one that can be stored that couldn't be stored previously. I'll just keep moving to see if we can get through these key points before I have to finish. Organic matter, of course, also is the only thing with negative and positively charged sites that can store everything, all minerals in the soil, including some of those very leachable things like nitrates, boron, sulphur and so forth. In fact, they can only be stored on humus because humus is the only thing with positive sites that can grab hold of those negatively charged minerals. Humus holds the fertiliser, so you're not losing from a hip pocket perspective. Of course, we're reducing the leaching of nitrates and phosphates, which are so environmentally damaging, erosion, and so forth. How do we do it? Well, we reward the most important profession on the planet with carbon credits. We condemn and penalise any action that destroys carbon in the soil and the creatures that produce it, and that is coming. There will be legislation that's already started in some countries, and that involves unbuffered nitrogen, some of the farm chemicals, tillage and a whole range of things. We fund native people to retain their forests. We've discovered now that it's not that easy to make a rainforest. We need to recognise that we don't have enough time. We need to put extreme value on what we've got left in terms of the lungs of the planet, those amazing rainforests.
Just a couple of slides left. We need to look at the inoculums of cellulose digesting organisms. They should almost become compulsory to make maximum use of any organic matter and convert it to humus. Humic acid, the most powerful stimulant of cellulose digesting fungi, will become increasingly important. Composting will become and should become second nature to everyone in agriculture and to all home gardeners. Rotational grazing, in terms of benchmarking of carbon building, by far the most effective way if you're running livestock to produce carbon and build carbon in your soils. Pasture cropping, I talk about those things at depth. We haven't got time currently, and we'll finish off after that whirlwind little tour. Farmers have a rare opportunity to play a major role in solving the greatest problem faced by humankind at this point, while also redesigning their own strategies. This is essential because it's becoming increasingly obvious that the cost of waging an unwinnable war against nature, which is what conventional agriculture has been in effect, will only increase. That cost will only increase with rising oil prices. The success of this biological approach here and in many other countries over the past decade highlights the fact that there is no sacrifice necessary to rally to this desperate cause. When we take carbon from the atmosphere and turn it to the soil as humus, our productivity increases. We boost water efficiency, we reduce pest and disease pressure, and we produce more nutrient-dense food for the health of everyone. It doesn't get much better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Graham.